thank you very much indeed for letting us come here this evening.
Very pleased to welcome you here. Is this a workshop? Because I hadn't realised that. It gives it a whole new excitement and level of status.
Give us something to do.
Well, yes, thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm a bit worried actually because you said I was going to tell you about how it's all set up and how it happened and how it fitted together.
Oh dear.
So we're here for the next 3 hours. But I'm sure you have papers to go to, Ms. Colville. This essentially is a little bit more than a museum of brands, packaging, advertising. It really is the story of the consumer. And the consumer, in many ways, began perhaps even back in Egyptian times and Roman times, when the story sort of fundamentally did begin. But essentially here we start off in the Victorian era, which was really the springboard of our consumer world. It started really at no particular time, except that in Victorian times, it was the beginning of what I term the pack age. This was a moment in time when instead of the grocer having to weigh out individually, bring the stuff in sacks into his shop, create individual packs for his requirements for every customer, suddenly it was the manufacturer who started to put those products into individual packets. And that was a major change, but of course it didn't happen overnight. And I often think of what we have here as an extraordinary revolution, but it did actually happen fairly gradually. Even by 1939, most biscuits were still being sold loose. And it was the supermarket that suddenly meant everything had to be pre-packaged and pre-weighed. So it was an evolution, but when you look at it like when you're going to race around, most people spend about 10 hours here, you're going to spend less than an hour. I say that slightly in jest, but occasionally we get somebody who's stuck in the museum who has to be thrown out. But essentially when you look at it like you'll be, it does feel actually like an extraordinary revolution. It has changed the way we live, the way we eat, the way we drink, the way we interact. It's all to do with our consumer culture. And this essentially is a heritage which, for the most part, hasn't been saved. And yet it is a vitally important heritage. And to me, when I started to collect these stories and collect the objects, it was a great surprise to me that there weren't other establishments that were saving these things. Yes, there are museums that have bits and pieces like everywhere, but nobody really had looked at it seriously, tried to understand how it developed and changed. And I felt there was a need to do that. That need and that idea happened to me on the 6th of September 1 year, and next year it'll be 50 years since that idea struck me. I was still at school. I didn't realise you could find old pieces of packaging, so I just saved contemporary packs, and I've been doing that every day ever since. It is quite difficult, believe you me. So that moment of celebration, I'm sure you'll want a little note in your diary for next year sometime, hopefully. I had Giles Brandreth here the other day, and I'm hoping to tie him up for a bit in the one show. I've known him for a number of years, so I'm waiting for some result to come. My God, it's difficult to get something like that on television. And it seems so trivial in a sense, because these things are just part of our throwaway history. They are just something we discard, we don't really notice, there it is, a bit of rubbish, and then suddenly it's gone. And that nevertheless is so pertinent to our lives. It is a fundamental part of the way we live today. We cannot live without packaging, we cannot live without these fast food brands. Some of us try to, but often we fail. And yet in your debate, it is very much part of how we live, and therefore a record has to be kept, and something which is important. It's vitally important. In 1,000 years' time, okay, we won't be here, but in 1,000 years' time, people will be looking back at this moment and looking at it as the beginning of this extraordinary story. I look back at it and think of it being in the Victorian times, but in fact, in terms of history, this is still the fundamental beginning of this story. Of course, today we have these extraordinary things called supermarkets with 40,000 different products just within a few metres of where we live, or so it seems. Some people still have to drive to find their supermarket, and they now have the luxury of filling up a car with stuff that they can put in our fridges and enjoy for the next week or so. Life was never like that if you go back to Victorian times. Things have totally changed, and yet we're not taught about this at school. We learn about it later on, perhaps. We learn about it if we come to a museum like this, but generally speaking we have no real feel how this extraordinary, utterly extraordinary story has developed and changed our lives. It is sort of forgotten almost. Sometimes it'll come up in the media, and usually it'll be some disaster that's happened. The sugar supply has suddenly ended. The toilet rolls are no longer available. Somebody has switched off the Lucasade tap. And then suddenly we have a problem, and the media go wonderfully excited by this tragic event, and very little respect or status is given to the industry that has made something unbelievable happen. I often think that it's actually more difficult to create a supermarket than it is to send man to the moon, because it is a very complicated subject. And we never actually understand it. It is so complicated we don't understand it. We don't have time to understand it. Maybe you guys can change that. I don't know. But that's what I've been trying to do, is to put back the status that I think all these people who are making these amazing things should have. We have professional people, we have science museums, we have galleries, we have museums dedicated to the wars. We have all kinds of amazing places, and we have about 3 million galleries, so it seems, dedicated to the arts. But where do we show this extraordinary consumer world? It's hidden, and that's partly because it's been tainted by the word commercial. This is a terrible kind of insight into what we respect. People who come to your home, who are just delivering things, will be shown round that entrance round there, called the tradesman's entrance. They never came through the front door. And this is something which we need to rectify, is that the grocers, the manufacturers, even the graphic artists, there you see Guinness advertising, mainly done by a well-known artist called Gilroy. Wonderful bits of creation, but not respected, not looked up to, because of course it's commercial. So many things that we can do to just show how extraordinary this change has been. And it's happened, in effect, very, very quickly in terms of things. You look back at the Attenborough years, as we've been doing on television, and you can see him, interacting with lions and tigers and giraffes over the last 60 years. In fact, those lions and tigers and giraffes haven't changed one jot. They're still exactly the same. But you look at the packaging from 60 years ago, and it's changed out of all recognition. So unless we rescue these things today, we will have no record of them for the future. And I always think that to understand the future, which all these companies are really dedicated to, you only can understand the future by understanding where we are today. And we only understand where we are today by understanding the past. It sounds very simple, but people forget that. So I'm very keen to rescue all these dying breeds of animals. Very important, but I'm also aware that we should be rescuing these dying brands that keep on disappearing. We need to know where we've come from. It's part of our heritage. It's part of understanding who we are and where we've come from, but also trying to look forward to the future. Now, as I say, it'll be 50 years next year since I was born. Since I started collecting, and I've done one other thing which I've been working on for the last couple of years. It seems like a lifetime now. The story of our throwaway history, and sometime in March or April next year I'll have this DVD ready. I'm just going to show you a quick extract of that. It's a little kind of taster, I think you would say in your journalistic terms. Taster for hopefully what is going to be a 2-hour documentary. And if technology works, I never believe it does until it happens, we'll see what it says.
What do all these things say about us? Or these? Or even these? Every day we're bombarded with hundreds of brands and products that form an essential part of our daily lives. For most of us, these come packed full of memory and meaning, a shared history that binds us together, even if we're not totally aware of it.
Golden Nuggets were just the best cereal ever.
Football crazies. They were a small packet of crisps, like maybe that big rectangle shape.
I had the perfume, I had the soap, I had the talc, I had the bath oil. It must have been overpowering.
I see all these things and they bring back so many memories from my childhood.
It's an emotional and nostalgic journey through our throwaway heritage and back through our childhoods and those of our parents and grandparents. It's a new way of looking at history, a history that's transformed the way we live, cook and eat, and given us a huge variety of convenient products and a seemingly endless supply of treats. Together, these items tell 100 different stories, from the changing role of women to the impact of war and technology, from the whims of style and fashion to the changes in social taste and tempo. So how did this consumer revolution come about? And let's see what all these brands mean to us.
Seeing the objects from a time maybe 40, 45 years ago is just really moving.
It's weird because every one of those things starts to evoke memories of not just the product but where you were and what you were doing when those things were just what were in the shops.
On this journey, we'll see our insatiable desire for things that are better, faster, tastier, and above all, more convenient. It's a fascinating insight into what makes us who we are. An exciting cornucopia of creativity and innovation. Join me, Robert Opie, and members of the Great British Public as we reveal the unexplored world of the things that once filled our cupboards. Let's explore, rediscover, and celebrate this extraordinary consumer heritage. Let's go in search of our throwaway history.
Well, I hope that's excited you a little bit about what's in store, because you multiply that up to 2 hours, and I think it'll be quite a mind-blowing topic that we haven't looked at before. I have to say, I did try and get this onto BBC Two, and indeed Channel 4 for that matter, and they were saying, oh, it's been done before. Have you any seen of that? Yeah, you see, they don't know what they're talking about half the time, do they?
Yeah.
Well, the museum is now ready to go, but just before you do go, since I never knew what to call a gaggle of journalists apart from hello and how nice to see you, but there are 2 words I do implore you never to use, particularly about me, if that's possible. The first one that people like to say is Opie's obsession. It's a passion. You know, there are lots of eccentrics around, and I'm probably one of them, but please call it a passion. And the other thing is, he's amassed 500,000 items. Well, yes, I've gathered together a lot of material, but I haven't amassed it. It's been very carefully assembled. And what you see here are 12,000 items of that assemblage. Rather like putting a jigsaw puzzle together, they have been carefully pulled out to tell a particular story, and each one hopefully fits with the next. And I am often asked, so I'll prevent that one question coming in, what's your favourite item? It's a difficult one to answer because essentially these 12,000 items are my favourites. And it's rather like putting that jigsaw puzzle together. When you put that together, you see a whole picture, a whole story. You take a few pieces out, it's incomplete. So to me, it's these items make up that extraordinary story. These items tell this glorious and remarkable story, and it is a journey. So when you go through, starting off in Victorian times, you'll come through eventually to a moment, and I'm going to warn you now, you'll come to a scary moment. So particularly you women, if you discover that moment, don't shriek out because you'll give your age away. That's what it's all about. So if there are any questions now.
Two related, very short. The first one, for which there is no answer except the personal. How do the products, the gastronomic products that are represented here, compare to the same foods as presented without a brand? The second, of those that survive, what is the total number of world corporations to which those products belong? And I suspect it's going to be somewhere under half a dozen.
That's an almost impossible question to answer, so thank you for that. I mean, the way you think, what can I say? If you go back 100 or so years, a big biscuit manufacturer would have 300 different brands of biscuit. Wouldn't necessarily call them brands of biscuit, but 300 varieties of biscuit. And over the years, that's decreased. If you go back over 100 years, there were probably 300 different, in this country, soap manufacturers. Today, maybe only half a dozen. And that's the way things have been changing. You know, constantly you think Cadbury could never be taken over, and suddenly a cheese giant comes along and nibbles them up. So the world is constantly changing and developing, and whether that's a good thing or not, it's difficult to say. I'm always being asked, you know, oh, this is, I was doing a radio interview the other day, how can we, you know, let these multinationals buy our British heritage? Well, it is sad, but, you know, we are now a global world, and that has changed the way things work. And, you know, you cannot stop those kind of things happening necessarily. It is the way it is. And if we want to have a competitive society, that's the way it's going to be. It's great that all the time these new brands come along, you know, is it green and black or black and green, I can never remember. But, you know, they are no longer independent. They were taken over by Cadbury's, as you know, who were taken over by Kraft, and who knows, some other giant coming along and swallowing up the Crafts sometime, dare I say it, one day. But we now have, is it Philadelphia, isn't it, now, with Cadbury's flavoured chocolate in it or something. There's no stopping progress. But, you know, that's part of the excitement, hopefully, of how we're living. So, you know, who can tell where it's going to end up? You know, as I say, another 1,000 years' time, there'll be something else happening. We'll just be fast fooding some kind of drip into our system that means we don't have to sit down and have a meal. Who knows? It's almost impossible to decide. And thankfully, I can't remember what that even more complicated question was to begin with, but I'll try and answer it later on. Are there any other burning questions?
Are you a private company or a charitable organisation?
The museum opened in 1984 in Gloucester. It had an exhibition at the V&A in 1975, which was, I knew it was, I mean this sounds terrible, but I knew it was going to be successful. But it was the first time in the history of the V&A they had to close the front doors, and we had huge numbers of people. It was free to go into, of course, so that didn't actually put people off, so everybody flocked in to see it, got a huge amount of media coverage. And it knocked the socks off Roy Strong's pedestal, because he could understand miniatures, but he couldn't understand an OXO cube. But it was quite startling because of that, and that wonderful thing of the V&A putting in an exhibition which was so everyday was a wonderful juxtaposition. So having established, and I'd only been, I think by the time I approached the V&A, I'd only actually been collecting the old story for 3 years. So it's a very cheeky thing for me to do. So I knew that the museum was something that we desperately needed as a resource for the nation. And the museum opened in 1984 in Gloucester. At that time, I was thinking about making it a charity, but a lot of people said if you make it a charity, you lose control, and that would be, you know, a horrible thing. So we ran it as a private museum. Then when we had to move out of Gloucester after 17 years, lease ran out, it was, where do we move now? And I got offers from every part of the country, but nowhere that seemed to make total economic sense. You cannot believe how difficult it is to run a museum without financial support. So when it seemed to make the most sense to move to London, which I'd always said I would never move to London, competition from 300 other museums. By now we had lottery money ploughing in lots of wonderful things for other museums, and the competition would have been fierce. So without the lottery funding, unfortunately, at that moment, we became a charity, and we were able to attract people like Kellogg's, Diageo, Cadbury's, Twinings, McVitie & Price, and so on, and they funded us just to get the museum up and running again, which was absolutely brilliant. So that's the reason we're here. We're now a full member of the charity process, and although I still own the collection, and I'm still adding to it every day and every week, it is nevertheless the museum is run as a charity.
So the collection's on loan to the charity, essentially?
It is, but I have another charity here. When I go, that'll go into that charity as well.
And does the charity accept bequests, and how do you deal with that?
Absolutely, yes. £1 million, £10 million.
No, I mean bequests of items.
Oh, absolutely, yes. I mean, I get people who come in virtually every day with a carry bag full of stuff, which I don't necessarily want, but out of those, every dozen or so, there might be one item. Then you get people who bring in, oh, this was my family business, and here is a mini archive. Somebody came in the other day with 200 Smartie packets, which he'd been saving for the last 20 years. Brilliant, because I don't have every Smartie packet over the last 20 years. I really recently got the very first one. And you know when the first Smartie packet was? Of course you do, you're journalists, you should know these things. No? Anybody want to guess when the first Smartie packet arrived?
1936.
You're too good! You're too good! 1937. You see, you shouldn't know answers like that. Spot the effect. Because most people think that these things came out when they first engaged with them. You ask any ordinary member of the public. You see, you spoil all my stories now.
Can I ask a final question? Do you get academics or brand economists or people coming here to study the evolution of brands to see which ones have been successful and which ones have been lost over the years because they've been mismanaged?
Yes and no. I don't know everybody obviously arrives just as they arrive, but I do discover people who are doing something a bit more serious than just down the kind of memory lane line. And I incidentally, just on that, I think this is the best place to come if you want to bring your parents or your children, because this really connects people. There is no other subject that I can think of that we engage in every day, that we have a relationship with, and that's what these brands are. They're like friends to us eventually. That's what this DVD is going to be talking about. They are like part of our extended family. We grow up with them. They're a continuity in our lives. I sometimes feel that Smarties will last longer than Royal Family, because why should we ever get rid of them? And so we do rely upon them. They are part of our infrastructure, and therefore they are incredibly important, but they're also this wonderful link. So you can, and the phrase that I hear so often is, I must bring my mum. And that I think is wonderful, because those stories that will come out from your mum will be both ways. You'll understand where your mum was at, but also your childhood, things that you don't necessarily remember. Those stories will come out because these are thousands of little triggers that will make you remember something so inconsequential, but it's a story for your family. So these are your roots in many ways, as much as anything else.
Are the brands that you include exclusively British?
Well, it depends what you mean by British, because all the brands here, or all the products here, are sold in the UK. Right. But of course, we don't exclude people like, you know, Kraft are American, or Heights are American, or Kellogg's are American, and you can go on and on, can't you? I mean, I was travelling to New York, I suppose a fair while ago now, and I was talking to the guy on my left, and he happened to be an Italian, and for some reason, God knows why, we happened to be talking about brands. Can't think how that subject came up. But he was saying, but Colgate, that is an Italian company. Fortunately, I had to tell him that it wasn't an Italian company. But nevertheless, it was an American company, but started by a Brit.
Can I just ask a quick question? Do you have a further archive? I mean, you must have archives.
Well, this is 12,000 items out of 500,000.
Okay, so where are the rest of them?
In some horrible large storage facility.
And are they catalogued, and is there a searchable catalogue? I mean, I know you're not a library.
Yeah, I have a dream. I have a dream.
Yeah, I just wondered, you know, when the question came about academics researching and things, I just wondered how, you know, what resources would be available, how they are.
It is, you know, if someone produced £5 million, we could do something. But this is the trouble, that, you know, we have to live in a way that is affordable, and the most important thing is for people to come here, engage with the subject, see its importance, its relevance, and so on. And thank God for journalists, because of course you're going to spread the word, hopefully, and encourage more people to come in. But build that status, because that's what we lack, as not as a museum necessarily, but just as a subject. It is not seen as something very important.
Is there anything you could point to where you felt the redesign or the repackaging was a disaster?
You know, I love disasters because they give me something to talk about. And you know, I talk quite often. I've got GSK coming here on Wednesday. I was talking to Unilever the other day. We have a lot of big companies here, and I have a lot of fun with them because they make mistakes, and other people make mistakes, and I use those mistakes, if that's what they are, to show how, you know, they can get around them or you can use them. And of course, a lot of topics we talk about, things like sustainability, which is desperately important, and you know, I can help them with things like that. I can also help them understand the consumer's relationship with the brand. And a lot of young people, some of you here, forget how important that relationship is. And pretty well, the various stories we've got on display of brand histories, and pretty well every brand history has got some little disaster or big disaster along the way. And these are multinationals making those mistakes. And it's usually done to the bright young up and coming people, you know, the new brand manager coming into a new job, you know, they've got to make their mark in the 2 years they're going to be there, and the excitable, you know, marketing team and all the rest of it, and they go off on some wild goose chase and overchange the brand, and suddenly that brand collapses, and they think, who made that mistake? Unfortunately, it was them, because, you know, we get attached to products, and we don't actually like change. We like consistency, we like continuity. And that's what we love brands for. And if we overchange them, or change them too quickly, or change them too often, or change, horror of horrors, 3 or 4 things at the same time, suddenly we as the consumer disconnect. It's like one of you coming in, you know, a friend of yours coming in, and suddenly they've got red hair. And you kind of do a double take, is that really you? And they've changed that profile and their image, and you just almost, you don't look at them in the same way. And there is a brand that I often quote in these talks that I'm not going to mention because you can discover it, where they did change 3 or 4 things, and suddenly that brand, instead of just declining gently, literally went down like that, and they had 6,000 letters, not emails, letters of complaint. And boy, did they have to change quickly. They even were phoning me up saying, oh, Robert, look, we're about to relaunch one of our brands. Relaunch? And I was thinking, now, what is that going to be? It didn't occur to me. They almost kind of, in their minds, they destroyed the brand sufficiently to have to relaunch it and almost bring it back from the dead. And yes, they did. And they did quite a good job at relaunching it.
Was it salad cream?
Spill the beans.
You probably don't even. I mean, it's a big brand. You'll discover it at the museum.
Guess at the end.
At the end. Right.
How long can you tease a journalist for? Is there an answer?
I told you. You're very nosy.
Okay, it's black magic.
Black magic.
Oh.
You've all heard of it. It was the first. It was the first brand to be thoroughly researched. Launched in 1933 at the height of the Deco era in a classic black box. The first time anybody had used black as a colour. Very daring, very exciting. But they researched it. They'd asked consumers. They'd been at the trade, and so on, so on, so on. And that pack design. Do you remember it? Some of you. 1932, right up until 1970, when they started to move it, and they moved it, and they slowly moved it a bit more, and moved it a bit more, and moved it a bit more. And for whatever reason, obviously I'm going to make the story up now, so don't quote me, the brand started to decline. This is always the horror moment. How do you recover a brand? That what you don't do is you overchange it. So they got their young, excitable team in. This is all off the record, you know what that means, don't you? They brought their young, excitable team in, and they changed the shape of the box. From a nice rectangular box, which all got used to, into a square box. And then they forgot to put the word black magic on the lid. They just put it nice and daintily around the sides. And then, just to make sure they had their suicide pact absolutely right, they looked inside the box and they didn't like what they saw. So they made each chocolate look pretty much the same as the next one. So there was no difference between one chocolate and another. So we eat with our sight, you know, we look at things, as you know, you're food journalists, I understand, you know, what you're looking at is going to add to that aura of what it tastes like. So they thought, well, each one looking the same, that's fine, we like that idea, it's very kind of black magic, isn't it? I don't know how they speak these days, but it's probably something like that. So, you know, each one looked the same, but there was a little kind of furrow in different ways, so if you really, it's rather like doing your flat plan, isn't it? It'll kind of, how do you make this bit of furniture? Does it go this way? So they put a little kind of line to qualify to see actually what it tastes like, but they'd taken away all the excitement of a different shape. Because we're human beings, we like things to be tactile. And then, just to make sure this brand was not going to succeed, they actually put each one through the mincer. So there was no nice bit of cherry, there was no nice walnut, it was all mushed up. And of course it just fell off the side of the world. And then they decided, what's gone wrong? Okay, so I came back to help them relaunch it with radio interviews and so on. And they went back to the kind of classic design-ish. Didn't quite get back to it. Anyway, I'm going to stop talking now, otherwise you won't have a chance to do actually what you came here to do. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
But you are staying around, aren't you?
I am
so
here, yes, don't worry.
So thank you very much.
Good.
That was an absolutely fantastic introduction to the museum, and if anyone's got any further questions, you'll be around. So
absolutely. We don't actually like change, and yes, of course, we can tweak things and manoeuvre things and change. You know, everything's gone from tin to plastic or from bottle to plastic, so things do change constantly. We should never change too many things at the same time. Johnson & Johnson baby powder is one of those. They changed. They came from a tin to a plastic, which was fine. They went into plastic, which was probably perceived as being more hygienic. But they did two other things at the same time, which annoyed people. One was they put a shape into it, which probably had a logic to it because it was easier to hold, but people didn't like it. It wasn't their brand any longer. And the absolutely crucifying thing they did was changing the lid from white to pink. You see? How infuriating that must have been.
Yes. There's just one other thing that I was thinking about, and that was that supermarkets try to indicate which products are cheaper, and they put them down, they put them up the side. But people go for those because they know they're going to be cheaper, but people who want the real thing don't go for them. But they're nevertheless terribly important.
I mean, the branding of them.
The branding of them. It's the
Well,
same
you know have
product,
supermarkets that have three-tier branding, you know, which was never the way. You know, you went into, in the old-fashioned days, you know, you went into a supermarket and you had the brand, and then you had the own label, and that was it.
Yes.
Didn't have to make any decisions. I mean, life just gets more and more complicated, doesn't it?
Because it's low calories now.
Well, I mean, just life, you might as well give up on life and just hope for the best. Keep your fingers crossed every time you go. Because whether people go in with a spyglass and read everything, I don't know. It's just, I mean, I don't care, you see, because all I'm doing is saving a representative sample. No one asked me that. But my life is an absolute complete nightmare. Because when I go to a supermarket with so much choice, what should I save this week? And I will go around the supermarket thinking what I should be saving this week, and then think, is there anything I want to eat amongst that lot? Because I've got to live as well. It doesn't often come up, but you've got to think through what does the collection need, and then what do I actually need. Maybe it's there, maybe it isn't.
Also, when you see other people's shopping baskets as they're checking out, you know that they've chosen things perhaps that you haven't even looked at.
Oh, totally. Yeah, totally.
More conditioned.
Yes. Yeah. But there are all kinds of things happening, which and every week I miss something. But I'm on my own doing that. I don't have a battalion of people doing it for me or just sending it to me.
May I just ask something very quickly, and I'll come back to you later, but I'm so sorry. I'm writing this up actually for the Guild website. And I just wondered if I could take some photographs just with my phone, only for my own use.
Yes.
Is that okay? I would like to talk to you a bit later. Thanks, my name's Celia. Nice to meet you.
When I came here half a century ago, I was intrigued at the familiar products on which the brand name had been changed. For instance, what I knew as fairy liquid in America was ivory liquid over here. And of course it would have been absolutely impossible to call it fairy liquid in America because the connotations were just too strong.
In fact, in San Francisco they imported fairy soap in great quantities for people living in San Francisco.
Yeah, exactly.